let's talk dungeons. Now, I'm using dungeon in a very, very broad, general role-playing sense. So I mean somewhere where you go to kill things and take their stuff, basically. So in a fantasy game, that might be a traditional underground series of tunnels and rooms filled with monsters and treasure and traps and all sorts of stuff. In a modern setting, it might be an office building or a bank that you're heisting, or enemy gangs' turf, the streets that they control, the buildings, the nightclub, and so on. But it's a place. It's a place where you go to do stuff. It's where sections of travel in Lord of the Rings end and they actually do something interesting and difficult. Like the underground city of the dwarves, which is overrun by goblins. That would be a classic dungeon. So that's what I mean by dungeon. A place where you go to do stuff. Dungeons do make excellent training wheels for new games masters and new players. It's a constrained environment in which you can shove the characters and test them out, see what they can do, see how the monsters play out. And a lot of early role-playing game supplements and so on do seem to follow this kind of model. You have a pretty much random assortment of rooms with a random assortment of monsters and treasure and wild and wacky traps and so on there, and the loosest possible reason to go there, which is usually for the sake of treasure. Yeah, and that's fine. That can be fun. That can be a lot of fun. But they got nicknamed as Monty Hall dungeons due to old game shows where people could just come on and take all kinds of stuff because of doing bizarre things in the context of the game show. And a lot of dungeons were like that in the early days. They were just chock full of nonsense. So in one room you might have a gang of goblins protecting some stack of treasure in a corner. If you go into the next room, there might be a dragon, much bigger than the doors to the room. You might choose to wonder how or why it got in there, but okay, there was a dragon. And then maybe off one of the rooms from the dragon's room, there might be a frictionless cylinder rotating at 5 RPM or something. You know, it made no sense, but that's fine. That can be fun if you just want to stretch your legs, get to know the rules and so on. Then yeah, that would pretty much pass muster. And a lot of the early adventures were like that. The Tomb of Horrors is basically a funhouse filled to the rafters with stuff that will kill you, and that goes for a lot of these early games and a lot of early supplements as well. You know, it's not just D&D, but Dragon Warriors was pretty much the same, though with maybe a bit more effort, and so on. For the first few games, particularly if you're young, particularly if you start gaming when you're kids, yeah, this all makes sense. You can let it go, and you can let your imagination run wild, and you can stuff whatever you want into the dungeon, let people kill it, overcome it, get killed by it, wander off with, you know, a golf bag full of +1 swords, whatever else. That's fine. It's great. It can be fun. But dungeons can be so much more than that. Now, this isn't a problem you tend to run into with modern games or science fiction games, because we have that expectation going into those modern spaces that they will make some kind of sense. For the most part, unless something's surreal or alien or multi-dimensional or whatever. You know, if you're going to raid an office building, we all have an idea in our heads of what an office building looks like. You know, water cooler, photocopier, stationery cupboard, cubicles, lift, stairs, windows, air conditioning. Yeah, we know what it's like. So to retain our suspension of disbelief and so on in a modern space is easy, and we can imagine and know roughly what an office space is like. But the same can't necessarily be said of dungeons. as undeniably fun as it can be to just murder your way through one room after another, slaying monsters, gathering loot, getting better items, and so on, eventually that kind of treadmill does become boring, and you want something more from your game. And the first step after that is probably to consider the space, the dungeon itself. What is it? Why is it here? Why hasn't anyone looted it before now? Has it been occupied in the past? What was it used for? How did this dungeon come about? If you're dealing with natural caverns and so on, you can grab some real maps. You'll find them much more boring than you would like your dungeons to be, but they can provide inspiration. You can wedge 2 or 3 different cave systems together, and occasionally in the real world there are fantastical things that you might want to include. Hot springs, underwater lakes with blind creatures in them, gigantic chambers full of crystals. These are all real things that you can bring back into your game and use. So natural caverns are great. Real buildings you can get blueprints of fairly easily, map spaces of fairly easily. Public spaces like museums and so on, they have maps for tourists to use. You can grab them, use them as inspiration for your own thing, and you can figure out how the space works. In modern and science fiction games we can pretty much figure it out, but with fantasy games it's a bit trickier. And we can't always have a barren circumvit to make sense of these nonsensical jumbles of rooms and monsters that we have by just saying he's a mad old wizard who likes making dungeons. That works to an extent, but not all the way. And sooner or later someone is going to notice that having this trap here and operating in this fashion doesn't necessarily make sense. So yeah, think about the space. Well, since modern and science fiction and horror is pretty much covered because we can relate to these spaces in our day-to-day lives, what about dungeons then? If you look at real-world dungeons, they were prisons, and their layouts weren't terribly complicated, and that's not really very interesting for us. In a fantasy world, there's more justifications for underground fortifications. There's dwarves, there's goblins, there's drow, there's all kinds of things that live underground because they don't like the sunlight and they want to stay away from it. It also makes sense in that above-ground castles are quite vulnerable to dragon fire or flying enemies and things like that. So having defensible underground spaces and storerooms and so on makes a lot more sense in that context. Churches have crypts. You can look to the Paris catacombs as an example. A low-level popular dungeon is often the sewers beneath somewhere. That's modelled after Victorian sewers, which doesn't really fit with the whole fantasy aspect, but, what the hell. There's dwarves and gnomes and things that are used to working underground. Maybe there's great cathedral-like spaces of dwarf-crafted sewerage, so your poop can travel around in style. But these are often good places for monsters to lurk and for adventurers to slaughter rats for their first few XP, That has a practical meaning and makes sense, and you can map it to the city above. Ruins might have tunnels beneath them. The old fortifications that we talked about earlier. And you can think about what these places were used for. You can make up your own justifications. The players don't necessarily need to know any of this right off the bat, but your dungeons will be better for you thinking about the purposes for which they were used, the remnants that might be in there, the history it might have had. Maybe there was a castle with an extensive dungeon storeroom beneath. The castle was attacked in a war 100, 200, 300 years ago and reduced to a ruin, so there's just walls and stone and maybe a couple of rooms above. But the dungeons beneath are relatively unscathed, and if you descend down into them, maybe there's barrels of old stale water, food supplies long gone to rot, strange and exotic fungus, and maybe creatures that prefer the darkness have taken this place as a lair, have remodelled it, burrowed extra tunnels, looted whatever remained. Now your dungeon starts to make sense, and it will be better for it. Taking your dungeons to the next level involves thinking about the relationship between the space and the creatures in it, and between the creatures, and between the space, the creatures, and the history of the space. And the more you do this, the more immersive and the more sense your dungeons will make overall. So if the goblins are settling in this room, why this room in particular? If the goblins are settled in a room right next to the den of some predatory beast, how is it they're getting away with not being eaten? Have they trained it? Do they offer it things? Have they worked out a way to fool it or bypass it or hide from it or something else? Just lock all these things together and make them make sense. I mean, you can do it post hoc. You can come up with a different reason. You can alter the dungeon topography. You can put a spring in somewhere if that's going to be a troglodyte camp or something. But you should try and make it all hang together. And are there different factions within the dungeon? Do the orcs like the lizard men? Do the lizard men like the orcs? Is there a truce between them? Could the adventurers maybe turn one group of monsters against another group of monsters? How often do they patrol? At what times? Are there women and children from one of these monstrous beasts around? And is the world that you play in one of these ones where alignment is innate, so orcs are literally born evil, or not? You know, think about all of these things and the history of the space. You know, was it razed to the ground by the creatures that now occupy it? Did they happen along on it later? What kind of rumours exist about the place? Are they using it as a springboard from which to attack local villages or raid caravans or whatever else? Think about all these interrelationships. Who knows about the place? Who knows what goes on there? What do the creatures that live there know about people outside? Is there any relationship between the dungeon and the local villages or the local townspeople or whatever else? Have the adventurers been sent out there as a sacrifice to keep the beasts from attacking the villages? Or have they genuinely been hired to clear the place out? What reason do the adventurers have to find and investigate this place? It could simply be treasure, it could be rumours, stories, a particular magic item that is said to be kept there. Maybe they encounter some bandits or whoever is using the ruins and then discover their hideout. So that's the next step. So you've gone from just taking a place and filling it with stuff to thinking about the context and history and physicality of the space and making that make sense, to making the things that occupy the space, the thinking, feeling, living and breathing beings that live there, to make them make sense within that context. And once you've done all that, and it does sound like a lot of work, but trust me, it does make a difference, then you've got a really, truly masterful dungeon. Zang. Do you like t-shirts?
Yeah, boy!
Do you like games?
Certainly.
Are you perhaps a little bit kinky?
Yes, quite.
Then buy one of our B&D t-shirts at Teespring. Teespring.com/stores/postmortem-studios. You want to be cool, don't you?
Does the word duh mean anything to you?